Hello everyone, welcome to Boring History Channel. Tonight, we step into a world where marriage wasn't about love, but strange rules, whispered vows, and laws so absurd they could trap you for life without witnesses, proof, or even intention. Imagine saying a few words and suddenly being married forever, or your entire future decided by customs that make no sense today. Stay with me, because once you enter this world, it's hard to look away and easier to drift into sleep as the past unfolds slowly. And before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy the stories I share here. The medieval world was governed by a strange blend of religion, superstition, local customs, and rigid social hierarchy. And nowhere was this more bizarrely evident than in marriage laws that often seem unbelievable today, ranging from the intrusive to the outright absurd. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not just a personal or romantic decision, but a deeply regulated institution controlled by the church, the state, and sometimes even local lords. And this resulted in rules that could dictate everything from who you could marry to how and when your marriage was considered valid. One of the strangest aspects was that in many regions, a marriage could be considered legally binding simply through mutual consent, even without witnesses or a ceremony, meaning that a couple could privately agree to be married and be recognized as such, which led to countless disputes where one party would deny the agreement ever took place. At the same time, the church insisted on public ceremonies to prevent such confusion, creating a contradictory system where both secret and public marriages could be considered valid under different interpretations. Even more peculiar was the requirement in some areas that a marriage had to be consummated to be fully recognized, leading to the infamous and invasive practice of bedding ceremonies, where guests would escort the couple to bed and sometimes even remain nearby to ensure the union was physically completed, turning what should have been an intimate moment into a public spectacle. In certain extreme cases, there were even officials or witnesses tasked with verifying consummation, a practice that seems shocking and intrusive by modern standards. Social class also played a massive role in dictating marriage laws, with peasants often needing permission from their feudal lord to marry, and failure to obtain this permission could result in fines or punishment, effectively making love subject to economic control. Among the nobility, marriage was less about affection and more about alliances, property, and power. And it was not uncommon for children to be betrothed at a very young age, sometimes even in infancy, with the expectation that the marriage would be fulfilled years later. Adding to the absurdity, there were laws governing consanguinity, or how closely related two people could be in order to marry. And at one point, the church banned marriages within 7 degrees of kinship, a rule so complex that it made it nearly impossible for people in small communities to find a suitable partner without violating the law, leading to widespread confusion and the need for special dispensations. In some cases, couples would deliberately seek these dispensations as a way to legitimize politically advantageous unions, effectively turning what was meant to be a moral safeguard into a bureaucratic loophole. Another bizarre practice was the concept of trial marriages in certain regions, where couples would live together for a year and a day to see if they were compatible. And if the arrangement did not work out, they could separate without stigma. a surprisingly progressive idea in contrast to the otherwise rigid norms of the time. Yet paradoxically, once a marriage was fully recognized by the Church, it was nearly impossible to dissolve, as divorce in the modern sense did not exist, and annulments were only granted under very specific circumstances, such as proving that the marriage was never consummated or that one party had been coerced. The criteria for annulment could be so peculiar that claims of impotence or even pre-existing secret vows of celibacy could be used to invalidate a marriage, leading to cases where deeply personal matters were scrutinized in public courts. In some regions, there were also laws that dictated the times of the year when marriages could take place, often prohibiting weddings during certain religious seasons like Lent, forcing couples to plan their unions around the church calendar rather than their own preferences. Additionally, there were strange customs tied to ensuring fertility and warding off evil spirits, such as requiring brides to wear specific charms or perform rituals that today would be seen as purely superstitious. In parts of medieval Europe, there were even symbolic acts like the hand-fasting ceremony, where couples would bind their hands together as a sign of their union, which in some places was considered legally binding, and in others merely a precursor to a formal wedding, adding yet another layer of confusion to what constituted a legitimate marriage. Property and inheritance laws further complicated matters, as marriage often determined the transfer of land and wealth. And this led to highly strategic unions where personal happiness was secondary to economic gain. Women in particular had very little agency in these arrangements, as their marriages were typically decided by their families, and once married, their legal identity was often subsumed under that of their husband. Some of the most absurd laws also involved penalties for breaking engagement contracts, where families could sue for damages if a promised marriage did not occur, treating the arrangement almost like a business deal rather than a personal commitment. In certain areas, there were even fines imposed if a widow remarried too quickly, as this was seen as disrespectful to the deceased husband, illustrating how societal expectations extended even beyond death. Perhaps one of the strangest beliefs influencing marriage laws was the idea that verbal declarations carried immense power, meaning that simply stating, "I take you as my spouse" in the present tense could be enough to create a binding marriage, whereas saying it in the future tense might not, leading to legal disputes hinging on the exact wording of a conversation. All of these peculiar rules highlight how medieval marriage was less about love and more about control, tradition, and social order, resulting in a system filled with contradictions and practices that seem almost unbelievable today. Yet they shaped the lives of countless people for centuries, demonstrating how deeply law, religion, and culture can intertwine to produce norms that, in hindsight, appear both fascinating and absurd. If those earlier customs already sound unbelievable, the deeper you go into medieval marriage practices, the stranger and more unsettling they become, revealing a world where law, superstition, and social control blurred into one. In many parts of medieval Europe, words alone could override reality, meaning that if two people exchanged vows privately, even impulsively, they could later find themselves trapped in a legally binding marriage they never intended to formalize, and this led to countless disputes where individuals tried to escape unions by arguing over the exact phrasing or context of what had been said. Some even attempted to manipulate this system, claiming a secret marriage to gain property or status, forcing courts to investigate deeply personal conversations with no witnesses, turning private speech into public legal drama. Equally bizarre were the rules surrounding marriage by abduction, which, although officially condemned, still existed in practice in certain regions, where a man could abduct a woman and later legitimize the union through marriage, especially if social or economic pressures pushed families to accept the situation after the fact. In some cases, the line between crime and custom was disturbingly thin, and what would now be considered a serious offense could be reframed as a pathway to marriage. Another strange dimension involved symbolic acts that carried full legal weight, such as handing over a glove, a ring, or even a coin, which could be interpreted as sealing a marriage agreement if accompanied by certain words, making everyday objects unexpectedly powerful in determining a person's future. In rural areas, local customs often overrode official church doctrine, creating a patchwork of conflicting rules where what was considered a valid marriage in one village might be completely rejected in another. This inconsistency led to situations where couples would move between regions to either validate or escape a marriage, essentially forum shopping in the medieval world. Even more peculiar were laws concerning physical conditions, where certain deformities or illnesses could be used as grounds to prevent or annul a marriage, reflecting a harsh and deeply judgmental view of human worth tied to physical appearance and perceived ability to fulfill marital duties. Superstition also played a massive role, with some communities believing that marriages conducted under the wrong astrological conditions or during unlucky days would doom the couple, leading to strict timing rules that had little to do with law and everything to do with fear of the unknown. In extreme cases, people delayed marriages for months or even years waiting for the right sign, while others performed elaborate rituals to counteract supposed bad luck, blending pagan traditions with Christian practices in ways that often contradicted official teachings. There were also peculiar expectations around gender roles that shaped marriage laws in unsettling ways, such as the idea that a wife was legally obligated to obey her husband in nearly all matters, and failure to do so could lead to social or even legal consequences, effectively turning marriage into a hierarchy rather than a partnership. In some regions, public humiliation was built into the system, where couples who violated social norms, such as marrying without permission or engaging in scandalous behavior, could be subjected to charivari, a noisy and mocking parade by villagers meant to shame them into conformity. This practice, while not always codified as law, was socially enforced with such intensity that it functioned as a powerful deterrent, showing how community pressure could be. As if those layers of confusion and contradiction were not enough, medieval marriage laws could descend even further into territory that feels almost surreal today, especially when you consider how deeply they penetrated everyday life and how casually they blurred the line between the personal and the public. In many places, marriage was treated not only as a contract between two individuals, but as a transaction between entire families, and sometimes even between communities, meaning that a single union could involve negotiations, disputes, and obligations that extended far beyond the couple themselves. This often resulted in situations where a bride or groom had little to no say in the decision, yet they were expected to uphold its consequences for life, regardless of personal feelings. Even more striking was the idea that silence could sometimes be interpreted as consent, particularly in arranged settings, where a lack of objection was taken as agreement, raising unsettling questions about how freely these unions were truly entered into. There were also peculiar rules surrounding remarriage that could border on the absurd, especially for widows and widowers. In certain regions, a widow needed explicit permission from her deceased husband's family to remarry, as her new union could affect property rights or inheritance lines, effectively binding her to her former husband's household even after his death. Some customs even dictated that a widow should marry her late husband's brother, a practice meant to keep property within the family, but one that ignored personal choice entirely. In other cases, widowers faced social suspicion if they remarried too quickly, as it was seen as a sign of disrespect, or even evidence that they had not truly mourned their spouse. These expectations created a strange social paradox, where individuals were both encouraged to remarry for stability and criticized for doing so too soon. Dowries and bride prices added yet another layer of complexity and absurdity, as marriage negotiations often revolved around wealth rather than compatibility. Families could spend years accumulating resources to secure a favorable match, and disputes over dowry payments could delay or even cancel weddings at the last moment, leaving couples in limbo. In some extreme cases, if the agreed upon dowry was not delivered, the marriage itself could be contested or invalidated, reducing the entire relationship to a financial agreement. Even more bizarrely, there were instances where symbolic dowries, such as livestock, tools, or even promises of future labor, were treated with the same seriousness as large sums of money, highlighting how flexible and yet rigid these systems could be at the same time. Certain local traditions introduced rules that seem almost unbelievable, such as requiring couples to publicly announce their intention to marry over several weeks, known as the reading of banns, to ensure that no one objected to the union. While this might sound reasonable on the surface, it often opened the door to interference, as anyone with a grievance, or even a personal vendetta, could step forward to challenge the marriage, sometimes on the flimsiest of grounds. This meant that a wedding could be halted not because of any real legal issue, but because of rumors, jealousy, or long-standing disputes between families in tightly knit communities, where everyone knew each other's business. This process could turn marriage into a public spectacle filled with tension and drama. Another strange aspect was the role of oaths and vows beyond the wedding itself, where couples were sometimes required to swear additional promises related to property, fidelity, or behavior, and breaking these could lead to severe consequences. These oaths were often taken in religious settings, giving them a spiritual weight that made them difficult to challenge or reinterpret later. Yet, despite this emphasis on permanence and seriousness, the system remained riddled with loopholes and inconsistencies, allowing those with enough influence or resources to navigate around the rules, while others remained trapped by them. In some cases, the absurdity reached its peak in the way disputes were resolved, with courts relying on testimony that could include hearsay, superstition, or even character judgments that had little to do with the actual issue at hand. A person's reputation, social standing, or perceived morality could carry more weight than concrete evidence, leading to outcomes that seemed arbitrary or unfair. This was particularly evident in cases involving accusations of infidelity or misconduct, where the lack of clear proof often resulted in decisions based on community opinion rather than factual certainty. Even the idea of love itself was treated in a surprisingly detached manner within these laws, as emotional connection was rarely considered a valid reason for marriage or separation. Instead, practical concerns, such as alliances, property, and social stability, dominated the conversation, leaving little room for personal fulfillment. This disconnect between law and emotion created a world where people could be legally bound to someone they barely knew, while genuine affection had little influence on the outcome. Perhaps most fascinating is how these laws coexisted with a parallel world of informal practices and quiet resistance, where individuals found subtle ways to assert their own choices despite the rigid system. Secret relationships, elopements, and informal unions persisted alongside official rules, revealing a constant tension between authority and personal desire. Yet even these acts of defiance could be pulled back into the legal framework, as authorities sought to regulate and control them, ensuring that no aspect of marriage remained entirely outside their reach. All of this paints a picture of medieval marriage as a deeply complex and often contradictory institution, shaped by forces that extended far beyond the individuals involved. What might seem absurd or even incomprehensible today was, for them, a structured and meaningful system, one that reflected their values, fears, and priorities. And while many of these practices have long since disappeared, they serve as a powerful reminder of how much social norms can change over time, and how something as personal as marriage can be transformed into a web of rules that govern not just relationships, but entire lives. And even beyond these already bewildering customs, medieval marriage laws could become so tangled in ritual, belief, and control that they sometimes bordered on the theatrical, as if society itself was staging a performance in which every couple had to play a strictly defined role. In some communities, symbolic gestures carried such exaggerated importance that failing to perform them correctly could cast doubt on the entire marriage, such as stepping over a threshold in the wrong way, dropping a ceremonial object, or even stumbling during the procession, all of which could be interpreted as bad omens or signs that the union was doomed. These beliefs, though not always formal laws, often carried the same weight in practice, as fear of social judgment could be just as powerful as legal consequences. At the same time, there were peculiar expectations around physical proximity and interaction before marriage, where even speaking privately or exchanging small tokens could be interpreted as a binding promise, creating a world in which ordinary human interaction was constantly under scrutiny and could unintentionally lead to serious commitments. In certain regions, there were also strange customs involving community approval that went far beyond simple consent, where neighbours or village elders could effectively judges whether a couple was suitable for marriage based on reputation, behaviour, or even rumours, and their disapproval could halt or complicate the process. This meant that personal relationships were never truly private, as the entire community acted as both audience and authority, reinforcing norms through collective pressure. In extreme cases, couples who defied these expectations could face exclusion, fines, or ongoing harassment, making it nearly impossible to live peacefully outside accepted standards. Even more bizarre were instances where animals or natural signs were interpreted as indicators of marital success, with certain bird calls, weather patterns, or random events being seen as divine messages either supporting or warning against a union. further blurring the line between law and superstition. Another layer of absurdity emerged in the way time itself was regulated within marriage, as some traditions dictated not only when weddings could occur, but also when certain marital activities were considered acceptable, often aligning with religious calendars that restricted intimacy during specific periods. This created a rigid schedule that couples were expected to follow, turning private life into something indirectly governed by external rules. Failure to adhere to these expectations could be seen as sinful or improper, even though they had little to do with the actual relationship between the fae. In a similar vein, there were expectations around fertility that placed immense pressure on newly married couples, with the success of a marriage often judged by how quickly children were produced, and failure to do so could lead to suspicion, blame, or even attempts to dissolve the union through claims of incapacity. Strangely enough, humour and mockery were sometimes built into the system itself, as certain customs allowed for playful yet pointed rituals that tested the couple's compatibility or resilience, such as riddles, symbolic challenges, or staged obstacles during the wedding process. While these might seem harmless, they often carried deeper meanings tied to societal expectations. And when you think it could not possibly get any more bizarre, medieval marriage customs reveal yet another layer where logic seems to dissolve completely into ritual, fear, and control, creating a system that often felt unpredictable even to the people living within it. In some regions, there existed the strange expectation that a couple's compatibility could be judged not only by social status or family approval, but by symbolic tests conducted during or after the wedding, where small incidents were interpreted as signs of future harmony or conflict, and something as trivial as a candle going out or a misplaced object could spark anxiety that the marriage was doomed from the start. These interpretations, though irrational by modern standards, were taken seriously enough to influence how the couple was treated by their families and communities, reinforcing a constant sense that their union was under observation not just by people, but by fate itself. There were also curious legal grey areas surrounding long-distance relationships and absences, especially during times of war or travel, when one spouse might be gone for years with no clear proof of whether they were alive or dead. In such cases, remarriage could become a legal nightmare, as returning spouses sometimes found their partners already married to someone else, leading to deeply complicated disputes over which marriage was valid. Courts had to decide between conflicting claims, often relying on incomplete information, and the outcomes could vary wildly depending on the circumstances, leaving individuals trapped in situations with no clear resolution. These cases highlight how fragile the institution of marriage could be when stretched across time and uncertainty. Another strange aspect was the belief that marriage could influence not just social standing but moral and even physical health, leading to the idea that an improper union could bring misfortune not only to the couple but to their entire household. This belief sometimes resulted in attempts to undo or avoid marriages based on omens, dreams, or the advice of local healers and mystics, blending legal decisions with spiritual interpretations in ways that defy modern reasoning. In some instances, families would go to great lengths to prevent a marriage they believed was cursed, even if there was no concrete evidence beyond superstition. The control exerted by families could also reach extraordinary levels, with some parents using legal and social pressure to enforce or prevent marriages in ways that left little room for individual choice. There were cases where individuals who resisted arranged marriages faced severe consequences, including disinheritance or social isolation, effectively forcing them to comply despite personal objections. At the same time, elopements, while romanticized today, were often fraught with risk, as couples who married without approval could face legal challenges, financial penalties, or lasting damage to their reputations, showing how tightly regulated personal relationships truly were. Even more perplexing were the expectations placed on communication between spouses, where certain behaviors or expressions could be interpreted as breaches of marital duty. Silence, tone, or even perceived disrespect could escalate into formal complaints, particularly in communities where maintaining social order was seen as a collective responsibility. This meant that even minor disagreements could take on a larger significance, as they were viewed not just as personal conflicts, but as disruptions to the social fabric. There were also unusual customs surrounding the physical spaces of marriage, such as the expectation that newlyweds would share specific living arrangements dictated by tradition rather than preference, sometimes involving extended families or communal environments that offered little privacy. These arrangements could intensify tensions and make it difficult for couples to establish their own identity as a unit, further emphasizing how marriage was embedded within a broader social structure rather than existing as an independent partnership. In some areas, there were even rules tied to clothing and appearance that reflected marital status, with certain garments, colors, or accessories signaling whether a person was married, widowed, or eligible for marriage. While this might seem harmless, it also functioned as a constant public display of personal status, leaving little room for ambiguity or privacy. Violating these expectations could lead to gossip or criticism, reinforcing conformity through subtle but persistent pressure. Perhaps most intriguingly, the concept of permanence in marriage coexisted with a surprising degree of improvisation in how laws were applied, as local authorities often had to interpret rules on a case-by-case basis, leading to outcomes that could feel inconsistent or even contradictory. This flexibility, while sometimes beneficial, also created uncertainty, as individuals could never be entirely sure how their situation would be judged until it was brought before a court or community. The result was a system that was both rigid in principle and fluid in practice, a combination that could be both protective and unpredictable. All of these elements combined to create a world where marriage was not a single event, but an ongoing negotiation between individuals, families, authorities, and beliefs, shaped by forces that extended far beyond the couple themselves. The absurdity lies not just in any one rule or custom, but in the cumulative effect of so many overlapping expectations, each with its own logic and justification, yet often contradicting one another. And still, despite the confusion, the pressure, and the occasional chaos, people continue to marry, adapt, and build lives within this system, revealing a resilience that stands in stark contrast to the strange and often bewildering rules that govern them. And still, even after all these layers of strange customs and contradictions, medieval marriage could become even more bewildering when you look at how deeply it intertwined with ideas of honor, reputation, and public image, turning private relationships into something that was constantly performed and judged. In many places, A person's entire social standing could hinge on how their marriage was perceived, which meant that even small rumours or misunderstandings could have serious consequences, sometimes leading to disputes that spiraled into long-standing feuds between families. Reputation was so fragile that a single accusation, whether true or not, could delay, damage, or completely destroy a proposed marriage. And because evidence was often unclear or based on testimony, truth itself became flexible, shaped by who was more convincing or influential. There were also oddly specific expectations about how affection should be expressed, or rather, how it should not be expressed, as excessive displays of emotion were sometimes frowned upon, especially among the upper classes, where marriages were expected to appear controlled, dignified, and strategic, rather than passionate. This created a strange contrast where love might exist, but it had to be carefully hidden or moderated to align with social norms, making marriage feel less like a personal bond and more like a carefully managed arrangement. At the same time, in other communities, exaggerated rituals of celebration were expected, with loud, prolonged festivities that served not just to celebrate the union but to publicly validate it, ensuring that everyone witnessed and acknowledged the marriage. Another peculiar element was how disputes within marriage were sometimes treated as communal matters rather than private ones, with neighbours, relatives, or local authorities stepping in to mediate or even judge conflicts. This meant that arguments, disagreements, or personal struggles could quickly become public knowledge, and solutions were often imposed based on what was considered best for social harmony, rather than individual happiness. In some cases, this led to resolutions that prioritized maintaining appearances over addressing underlying issues, leaving couples to navigate a reality that was shaped more by external expectations than their own needs. There were also unusual beliefs surrounding the idea of compatibility that went beyond personality or shared values, extending into symbolic or even mystical interpretations, where factors like birth order, family background, or perceived balance between partners were used to determine whether a marriage would succeed. These ideas could influence decisions in ways that seem arbitrary today, yet they were treated with seriousness at the time, adding another unpredictable layer to the process. Families might reject a perfectly suitable match based on these considerations, while accepting another that met the criteria but lacked genuine connection. In some instances, the absurdity reached into the realm of language itself, where misunderstandings or deliberate misinterpretations could alter the course of a marriage, because so much weight was placed on spoken agreements. The exact wording of a promise or declaration could become the focus of intense scrutiny, with disputes arising over whether something was said in the present or future tense, or whether it was meant seriously or in jest. This created a situation where language was both powerful and precarious, capable of binding people together or unraveling their commitments based on subtle differences in phrasing. Even the concept of forgiveness within marriage could take on strange forms, as certain customs encouraged reconciliation through symbolic acts rather than genuine resolution, such as public apologies, ritual gestures, or community. Imposed agreements that required couples to present a united front, regardless of their true feelings. And when you think it could not possibly get any more bizarre, medieval marriage customs reveal yet another layer where logic seems to dissolve completely into ritual, fear, and control, creating a system that often felt unpredictable, even to the people living within it. In some regions, there existed the strange expectation that a couple's compatibility could be judged not only by social status or family approval, but by symbolic tests conducted during or after the wedding, where small incidents were interpreted as signs of future harmony or conflict, and something as trivial as a candle going out or a misplaced object could spark anxiety that the marriage was doomed from the start. These interpretations, though irrational by modern standards, were taken seriously enough to influence how the couple was treated by their families and communities, reinforcing a constant sense that their union was under observation not just by people, but by fate itself. There were also curious, legal grey areas surrounding long-distance relationships and absences, especially during times of war or travel, when one spouse might be gone for years with no clear proof of whether they were alive or dead. In such cases, remarriage could become a legal nightmare, as returning spouses sometimes found their partners already married to someone else, leading to deeply complicated disputes over which marriage was valid. Courts had to decide between conflicting claims, often relying on incomplete information, and the outcomes could vary wildly depending on the circumstances, leaving individuals trapped in situations with no clear resolution. These cases highlight how fragile the institution of marriage could be when stretched across time and uncertainty. Another strange aspect was the belief that marriage could influence not just social standing, but moral and even physical health, leading to the idea that an improper union could bring misfortune not only to the couple, but to their entire household. This belief sometimes resulted in attempts to undo or avoid marriages based on omens, dreams, or the advice of local healers and mystics, blending legal decisions with spiritual interpretations in ways that defy modern reasoning. In some instances, families would go to great lengths to prevent a marriage they believed was cursed, even if there was no concrete evidence beyond superstition. The control exerted by families could also reach extraordinary levels, with some parents using legal and social pressure to enforce or prevent marriages in ways that left little room for individual choice. There were cases where individuals who resisted arranged marriages faced severe consequences, including disinheritance or social isolation, effectively forcing them to comply despite personal objections. At the same time, elopements, while romanticized today, were often fraught with risk, as couples who married without approval could face legal challenges, financial penalties, or lasting damage to their reputations, showing how tightly regulated personal relationships truly were. Even more perplexing were the expectations placed on communication between spouses, where certain behaviors or expressions could be interpreted as breaches of marital duty. Silence, tone, or even perceived disrespect could escalate into formal complaints, particularly in communities where maintaining social order was seen as a collective responsibility. This meant that even minor disagreements could take on a larger significance, as they were viewed not just as personal conflicts, but as disruptions to the social fabric. There were also unusual customs surrounding the physical spaces of marriage, such as the expectation that newlyweds would share specific living arrangements dictated by tradition rather than preference, sometimes involving extended families or communal environments that offered little privacy. These arrangements could intensify tensions and make it difficult for couples to establish their own identity as a unit, further emphasizing how marriage was embedded within a broader social structure rather than existing as an independent partnership. In some areas, there were even rules tied to clothing and appearance that reflected marital status, with certain garments, colours, or accessories, signalling whether a person was married, widowed, or eligible for marriage. While this might seem harmless, it also functioned as a constant public display of personal status, leaving little room for ambiguity or privacy. Violating these expectations could lead to gossip or criticism, reinforcing conformity through subtle but persistent pressure. Perhaps most intriguingly, the concept of permanence in marriage coexisted with a surprising degree of improvisation in how laws were applied, as local authorities often had to interpret rules on a case-by-case basis, leading to outcomes that could feel inconsistent or even contradictory. This flexibility, while sometimes beneficial, also created uncertainty, as individuals could never be entirely sure how their situation would be judged until it was brought before a court or community. The result was a system that was both rigid in principle and fluid in practice, a combination that could be both protective and unpredictable. All of these elements combined to create a world where marriage was not a single event, but an ongoing negotiation between individuals, families, authorities, and beliefs, shaped by forces that extended far beyond the couple themselves. The absurdity lies not just in any one rule or custom, but in the cumulative effect of so many overlapping expectations, each with its own logic and justification, yet often contradicting one another. And still, despite the confusion, the pressure, and the occasional chaos, people continue to marry, adapt, and build lives within this system, revealing a resilience that stands in stark contrast to the strange and often bewildering rules that governed them. And still, even after all these layers of strange customs and contradictions, medieval marriage could become even more bewildering when you look at how deeply it intertwined with ideas of honour, reputation, and public image, turning private relationships into something that was constantly performed and judged. In many places, a person's entire social standing could hinge on how their marriage was perceived, which meant that even small rumours or misunderstandings could have serious consequences, sometimes leading to disputes that spiraled into long-standing feuds between families. Reputation was so fragile that a single accusation, whether true or not, could delay, damage, or completely destroy a proposed marriage. And because evidence was often unclear or based on testimony, truth itself became flexible, shaped by who was more convincing or influential. There were also oddly specific expectations about how affection should be expressed, or rather, how it should not be expressed, as excessive displays of emotion were sometimes frowned upon, especially among the upper classes, where marriages were expected to appear controlled, dignified, and strategic rather than passionate. This created a strange contrast where love might exist, but it had to be carefully hidden or moderated to align with social norms, making marriage feel less like a personal bond and more like a carefully managed arrangement. At the same time, in other communities, exaggerated rituals of celebration were expected, with loud, prolonged festivities that served not just to celebrate the union, but to publicly validate it, ensuring that everyone witnessed and acknowledged the marriage. Another peculiar element was how disputes within marriage were sometimes treated as communal matters rather than private ones with neighbours, relatives, or local authorities, stepping in to mediate or even judge conflicts. This meant that arguments, disagreements, or personal struggles could quickly become public knowledge, and solutions were often imposed based on what was considered best for social harmony rather than individual happiness. In some cases, this led to resolutions that prioritized maintaining appearances over addressing underlying issues, leaving couples to navigate a reality that was shaped more by external expectations than their own needs. There were also unusual beliefs surrounding the idea of compatibility that went beyond personality or shared values, extending into symbolic or even mystical interpretations, where factors like birth order, family background, or perceived balance between partners were used to determine whether a marriage would succeed. These ideas could influence decisions in ways that seem arbitrary today, yet they were treated with seriousness at the time, adding another unpredictable layer to the process. Families might reject a perfectly suitable match based on these considerations, while accepting another that met the criteria but lacked genuine connection. In some instances, the absurdity reached into the realm of language itself, where misunderstandings or deliberate misinterpretations could alter the course of a marriage. Because so much weight was placed on spoken agreements, the exact wording of a promise or declaration could become the focus of intense scrutiny, with disputes arising over whether something was said in the present or future tense, or whether it was meant seriously or in jest. This created a situation where language was both powerful and precarious, capable of binding people together or unraveling their commitments based on subtle differences in phrasing. Even the concept of forgiveness within marriage could take on strange forms, as certain customs encouraged reconciliation through symbolic acts rather than genuine resolution, such as public apologies, ritual gestures, or community. Imposed agreements that required couples to present a united front regardless of their true feelings. And even after all these strange rules and contradictions, medieval marriage practices still had more layers that feel almost unbelievable today, especially in how they blurred the boundaries between truth, performance, and obligation. In many cases, marriage was not a single clear event, but an evolving status that could be reinforced, questioned, or even reshaped over time depending on circumstances. A couple might be treated as married in their daily life, sharing responsibilities and social recognition, yet still face challenges to their legitimacy. If someone brought up a forgotten detail, a past promise, or a procedural flaw, creating a constant tension between lived reality and legal definition. This meant that marriage was not always a stable foundation, but sometimes a fragile agreement that could be revisited unexpectedly. One particularly strange aspect was how storytelling itself could influence marriage outcomes, as narratives constructed by families or communities often carried as much weight as actual events. If a story about a couple, whether flattering or damaging, became widely accepted, it could shape how their relationship was judged, sometimes overriding facts. This reliance on collective perception made reputation incredibly powerful, turning marriage into something that existed not just between two people, but within the shared imagination of those around them. In this sense, a marriage could succeed or fail not only because of the couple's actions, but because of how their story was told and believed by others. There were also unusual expectations about continuity and consistency, where individuals were expected to behave in ways that aligned with their marital role at all times, even in situations where it might not make practical sense. Deviating from these expectations, whether in public behavior, decision-making, or even emotional expression could lead to suspicion or criticism, as it was seen as a sign that the marriage itself might be unstable. This constant pressure to conform created an environment where authenticity was often secondary to maintaining appearances, reinforcing the idea that marriage was as much about perception as it was about reality. In some regions, there were even curious customs related to silence and secrecy, where certain aspects of marriage were deliberately kept unspoken or hidden, not because they were unimportant, but because acknowledging them openly could disrupt the social balance. This created a paradox where everyone understood certain truths, but avoided discussing them directly, allowing the system to function without confronting its own contradictions. Such unspoken agreements highlight how deeply ingrained these practices were, shaping behavior in subtle yet powerful ways. Another layer of absurdity emerged in how time and change were handled within marriage, as people were expected to adapt to evolving circumstances without necessarily altering the formal structure of their union. For example, significant changes in status, wealth, or personal circumstances could transform the nature of a marriage, yet the original agreement remained in place, creating a disconnect between the formal definition and the lived experience. This rigidity, combined with the fluidity of interpretation, made marriage both stable and unstable at the same time. There were also peculiar ideas about balance and fairness, where relationships were sometimes judged based on whether they appeared equal in terms of social standing, resources, or influence, rather than on the actual dynamics between the individuals involved. This could lead to situations where a marriage was considered inappropriate or problematic, not because of any real conflict, but because it did not fit the expected pattern, reinforcing a highly structured view of relationships that left little room for variation. Even more fascinating is how conflict within marriage was often reframed as something that needed to be managed rather than resolved, with an emphasis on restoring harmony rather than addressing underlying issues. This approach sometimes resulted in temporary solutions that maintained social order while leaving deeper tensions unresolved, creating a cycle where the appearance of stability was prioritized over genuine well-being. It reflects a broader pattern in medieval society, where maintaining the system was often more important than questioning it. There were also strange expectations surrounding legacy and continuity, where the success of a marriage was measured not just by the couple's relationship, but by what it produced, whether in terms of children, property, or social connections. This forward-looking perspective placed additional pressure on couples to fulfill roles that extended beyond their immediate experience, tying their personal lives to broader goals that they might not have chosen for themselves. Ultimately, the further you explore medieval marriage customs, the more it becomes clear that they operated within a framework that prioritized structure, symbolism, and social cohesion over individual experience. The absurdity lies in how many different layers, legal, cultural, religious, and communal, were woven together into a system that could feel both rigid and unpredictable at the same time. And yet, despite all these complexities, people continued to navigate their relationships, finding ways to adapt, endure, and even thrive within a system that, from today's perspective, seems almost impossibly intricate and at times astonishingly strange. And even beyond everything already described, medieval marriage practices could become so intricate and surreal that they almost resembled a system designed more to test human endurance than to support human connection, as layers of expectation continued to accumulate around something that was, at its core, meant to be simple. In many cases, marriage was treated as a kind of social anchor, binding not just two individuals, but entire networks of obligations that extended outward in all directions, making it nearly impossible to separate personal life from collective responsibility. This meant that a decision to marry was never truly isolated. It carried ripple effects that could influence alliances, property arrangements, and even future generations, turning what might seem like a private choice into a matter of wide-reaching consequence. There were also peculiar expectations surrounding consistency over time, where individuals were expected to uphold the same commitments and behaviors regardless of changing circumstances, as if the moment of marriage froze certain aspects of life in place. Even when situations evolved, whether through shifts in wealth, status, or personal growth, the original expectations often remained, creating tension between who people were and who they were expected to be. This rigidity could make adaptation difficult, as any deviation might be interpreted as a failure to honor the marriage itself, rather than a natural response to changing conditions. In some communities, there were even subtle forms of surveillance embedded within daily life, where the behavior of married couples was quietly observed and interpreted by those around them, reinforcing norms without the need for formal enforcement. A glance, a tone of voice, or a small action could be noticed and discussed, contributing to an ongoing narrative about the state of a marriage. This constant awareness of being watched, whether literally or socially, added a layer of pressure that shaped how couples interacted, often encouraging them to present a harmonious image even when reality was more complicated. Another strange dimension was the way in which responsibility within marriage could be distributed unevenly, yet still framed as balanced or fair according to societal standards. Expectations were often predefined, leaving little room for negotiation, and individuals were judged based on how well they fulfilled these roles, rather than how the relationship functioned as a whole. This created a system where success was measured by adherence to norms rather than by mutual satisfaction, reinforcing a structured but sometimes inflexible understanding of partnership. There were also curious beliefs about continuity beyond the visible aspects of marriage, where the union was thought to carry an almost symbolic or spiritual weight that extended into areas of life that had little direct connection to the relationship itself. For example, success in work, harmony within the household, or even general fortune could be linked to the perceived strength or legitimacy of a marriage, creating a feedback loop where external events were interpreted as reflections of the union's quality. This interconnected view of life added another layer of meaning and pressure to marriage, as it became a lens through which many aspects of existence were understood. In certain cases, the absurdity emerged in how rules interacted with one another, creating situations where following one expectation could inadvertently violate another, leaving individuals caught in a web of conflicting demands. Navigating these contradictions required careful judgment and, at times, creative interpretation, as people sought ways to satisfy multiple expectations without triggering negative consequences. This constant balancing act highlights how medieval marriage was not just a set of rules to follow, but a complex system to be managed. There were also unusual expectations around resilience, where enduring difficulty within marriage was often seen as a virtue in itself, regardless of the nature of the challenges involved. This perspective encouraged persistence and stability, but could also discourage individuals from seeking change or improvement, reinforcing a culture where maintaining the structure of marriage was prioritized over addressing its flaws. And even at this point, the strange world of medieval marriage can stretch further into a realm where rules, beliefs, and expectations became so layered that they sometimes seem to contradict the very purpose of marriage itself, turning it into a structure that people had to constantly interpret rather than simply live within. In many cases, marriage functioned almost like a social identity that needed continuous reinforcement, where couples were expected to repeatedly demonstrate their legitimacy through behavior, participation in community life, and adherence to visible norms, as if the original union alone was not enough to secure its place. This created a situation where being married was not just a status you acquired, but one you had to actively maintain in the eyes of others. There were also peculiar expectations about predictability, where society assumed that marriage should follow a certain pattern over time, and any deviation from this pattern, whether in terms of roles, responsibilities, or outcomes, could raise suspicion or concern. If a couple did not behave in ways that aligned with these expectations, their marriage might be questioned not because of any clear violation, but because it did not look right. According to the unwritten rules of the community, this emphasis on appearance over reality added yet another layer of pressure, as couples had to navigate not only their own relationship, but also how it was perceived from the outside. In some instances, the absurdity was amplified by the way in which different stages of life were tied to marriage in rigid ways, with clear expectations about when one should marry, how long certain phases should last, and what milestones should be achieved within specific timeframes. Falling outside of these expectations, whether by marrying too early, too late, or not at all, could lead to social consequences, making marriage not just a personal decision, but a marker of conformity to a broader timeline imposed by society. This structured approach to life left little room for individual variation, reinforcing a sense that personal choices were secondary to collective norms. Another unusual aspect was the way in which responsibility for the success or failure of a marriage could be unevenly assigned, often influenced by existing social hierarchies or assumptions about gender and status. This meant that one person might be held accountable for issues that were actually shared, creating an imbalance that shaped how conflicts were understood and addressed. These interpretations were rarely neutral. They were embedded within a larger framework of expectations that dictated who was supposed to lead, who was supposed to follow, and how each person's actions were judged. There were also curious ideas about permanence that went beyond the legal definition of marriage, extending into the way people thought about connection and obligation. Even when circumstances changed dramatically, the expectation of continuity remained strong, as if the bond itself existed independently of the conditions surrounding it. This belief reinforced a sense of stability, but it could also create tension when reality did not align with expectation, leaving individuals to reconcile the gap between what was supposed to endure and what was actually happening. In certain communities, there were subtle yet powerful rituals that marked transitions within marriage, such as shifts in responsibility, status, or social role. And these were often recognized informally rather than through official declarations. These transitions could influence how a couple was treated by others, shaping their experience in ways that were not always immediately visible, but deeply felt over time. It added another dimension to marriage, where change was acknowledged through custom rather than law, further complicating the overall structure. Even more fascinating is how memory and history played a role in shaping marriages, as past events, whether personal or familial, could influence present decisions and future expectations. A family's history of successful or failed marriages, for example, might affect how a new union was perceived, creating a sense that individuals were not only carrying their own choices, but also the weight of those who came before them. This continuity between past and present added depth to the institution of marriage, but also reinforced patterns that could be difficult to break. The absurdity becomes most apparent when you consider how all these elements, legal rules, social expectations, cultural beliefs, and personal experiences, interacted with one another in ways that were not always consistent or predictable. A marriage could be seen as perfectly valid in one context and questionable in another, depending on which set of rules or interpretations was applied. This fluidity made the system both adaptable and confusing, as individuals had to constantly navigate a shifting landscape of expectations. And yet, despite all of this complexity, people still found ways to form meaningful connections, to negotiate their roles, and to build lives within a system that often seemed overwhelming. The medieval approach to marriage, with all its strange and sometimes baffling customs, ultimately reflects a world that sought to bring order to something inherently unpredictable, using whatever tools and beliefs were available at the time. What appears absurd now was once a deeply embedded reality, shaped by a different understanding of life, community, and responsibility. And it serves as a reminder of how much human institutions can evolve while still retaining their fundamental purpose of connecting people together. And even after peeling back all of these layers, medieval marriage still reveals yet another dimension of strangeness, when you consider how deeply it was tied to control over uncertainty, as if society attempted to regulate not just relationships, but the unpredictable nature of life itself through marriage. In many ways, marriage functioned as a stabilizing mechanism in a world filled with risk, war, disease, shifting alliances. And so it accumulated rules meant to reduce unpredictability. Yet, paradoxically, those very rules often introduced new forms of confusion. Couples were expected to embody stability, yet they were bound by systems that could shift depending on interpretation, authority, or circumstance, making their lives anything but stable in practice. There were also peculiar expectations about continuity of behavior, where once married, individuals were assumed to act in ways that reflected not only their current status, but also an idealized version of what a married person should be. This expectation could override personal traits or preferences, as people were subtly pressured to reshape themselves to fit the role they had entered. Over time, this created a kind of performative identity, where being married meant consistently demonstrating certain behaviors, even if they did not come naturally, reinforcing the idea that marriage was as much about maintaining an image as it was about living a shared life. In some cases, the absurdity emerged in how small details could take on disproportionate importance, as minor actions or decisions were interpreted as indicators of the overall health or legitimacy of a marriage. A disagreement over a trivial matter could be seen as a sign of deeper instability, while a well-managed public appearance could mask significant private issues. This tendency to draw broad conclusions from limited observations reflects a system that relied heavily on symbolism and perception, sometimes at the expense of reality. Another strange element was the way in which expectations could accumulate over time without ever being fully clarified, creating a kind of invisible framework that people were expected to understand and follow without explicit guidance. New couples often had to learn these expectations through observation or correction, navigating a landscape of unspoken rules that could vary from one community to another. This lack of clarity made it easy to unintentionally violate norms, leading to misunderstandings or social friction that could have been avoided if the rules were more transparent. There were also unusual ideas about balance within marriage, where relationships were often judged based on whether they appeared to fit a certain equilibrium defined by social standards, rather than by the actual experience of the individuals involved. This external measure of balance could conflict with personal reality, as couples might be seen as well, matched despite internal struggles, or mismatched despite genuine compatibility. It highlights how much weight was placed on outward conformity rather than inward connection. In certain contexts, marriage was also linked to broader ideas of order and hierarchy, with each union reinforcing the structure of society as a whole. This meant that individual marriages were not just personal arrangements, but building blocks of a larger system, and maintaining their stability was seen as essential to maintaining social order. As a result, pressure to conform did not come only from immediate family or community, but from a wider cultural expectation that marriage should function in a specific way. Even more fascinating is how adaptability coexisted with rigidity. As people found ways to interpret or adjust the rules to suit their circumstances while still presenting their actions as consistent with tradition. This creative navigation allowed individuals to carve out space for personal agency within a restrictive system, but it also contributed to the overall complexity, as different interpretations could coexist and sometimes conflict with one another. There were also curious expectations about memory and accountability, where past actions, promises, or events could be revisited and reinterpreted long after they occurred. And even after exploring all of these layers, the world of medieval marriage continues to unfold into something even more intricate and almost paradoxical, where the very attempt to control relationships often made them more unpredictable and complex. In many ways, marriage functioned like a living system that had to constantly be balanced, adjusted, and interpreted, rather than a fixed agreement that simply guided two people through life. This meant that individuals were not just participants in marriage, but active navigators of an ever-shifting set of expectations, where understanding the system was just as important as living within it. One of the more unusual aspects was how permanence and uncertainty coexisted side by side, creating a situation where marriage was considered unbreakable in principle, yet constantly vulnerable in practice. A union might be declared lifelong and sacred, yet still be subject to challenges, reinterpretations, or disputes that could alter its meaning or status over time. This contradiction meant that people had to hold two opposing ideas at once. that their marriage was both secure and potentially fragile, leading to a unique kind of psychological tension that shaped how they approached their relationships. There were also peculiar expectations around adaptability, where individuals were expected to adjust to changing circumstances without necessarily changing the structure of the marriage itself. This could create situations where the outward form of the relationship remained the same, while the internal dynamics shifted significantly, leading to a disconnect between appearance and reality. In some cases, this adaptability was a strength, allowing couples to endure difficult situations, but in others, it reinforced patterns that were difficult to change, even when they no longer served the individuals involved. Another strange dimension was the way in which authority operated within marriage, not as a single clear source, but as a combination of influences that could overlap or conflict. Religious doctrine, local customs, family expectations, and community norms all played a role, and navigating these different sources of authority required careful judgment. A decision that satisfied one authority might conflict with another, leaving individuals to weigh their options and choose which expectations to prioritize, often without clear guidance on the consequences. There were also unusual ideas about continuity that extended beyond the couple themselves, as marriage was often seen as part of a larger chain of relationships that connected past, present, and future. This meant that individuals were not only responsible for their own union, but also for maintaining a sense of continuity with their family's history and their community's expectations. The pressure to uphold this continuity could influence decisions in subtle ways, shaping how people approached their roles and responsibilities within marriage. In some instances, the absurdity became evident in how minor variations in circumstance could lead to vastly different outcomes, as similar situations were interpreted differently depending on context, timing, or the individuals involved. This inconsistency made the system difficult to predict, as there was no single standard that applied universally, only a collection of guidelines that were adapted to fit each case. As a result, individuals often had to rely on experience, advice, or intuition to navigate their situations, rather than on a clear set of rules. Even more fascinating is how resilience was built into the system, not through simplicity, but through complexity, as the multiple layers of expectation provided various ways for relationships to be sustained, even when challenges arose. If one aspect of the system failed, another might compensate, allowing the marriage to continue in a different form. This flexibility, while sometimes confusing, contributed to the longevity of the institution, as it could adapt to a wide range of circumstances without losing its overall structure. There were also curious expectations about identity within marriage, where individuals were expected to balance their personal sense of self with their role within the relationship, often prioritizing the latter. This could lead to a gradual reshaping of identity over time, as people adapted to the expectations placed upon them, sometimes at the expense of their own preferences or ambitions. Yet within this process, there was also room for subtle negotiation, as individuals found ways to express themselves within the boundaries of their roles. Ultimately, the deeper you explore medieval marriage, the more it becomes clear that its complexity was not accidental, but a reflection of the broader society in which it existed, one that valued order, continuity, and structure. even at the cost of simplicity. The absurdity lies in how these values were translated into a system that could feel overwhelming and contradictory, yet still functioned as a central part of life. And within this intricate framework, people continued to form connections, adapt to challenges, and find meaning in their relationships, demonstrating that even the most elaborate systems cannot fully define or contain the human experience. And even after all of these layers, the deeper reality of medieval marriage becomes even more astonishing when you realize that it was not just governed by rules, but by a constant negotiation between what was written, what was believed, and what was actually lived. In many cases, the formal structure of marriage existed almost like a framework that people had to interpret in real time, adjusting their understanding based on circumstances that could change without warning. This created a world where certainty was rare and where individuals had to develop a kind of social intelligence just to navigate their own relationships, reading between the lines of customs, expectations, and unspoken norms. One of the most unusual aspects was how stability was often achieved, not by removing complexity, but by embracing it, as multiple overlapping rules allowed for flexibility in interpretation. If one rule created a problem, another might offer a way around it, meaning that the system could adapt without formally changing. However, this also meant that outcomes were rarely straightforward, and that two similar situations could lead to completely different results depending on how the rules were applied. This unpredictability made marriage feel less like a fixed institution and more like a shifting landscape that required constant awareness and adjustment. There were also peculiar expectations around perception, where what others believed about a marriage could be just as important as what the couple themselves experienced. A relationship that appeared stable and respectable could be treated as successful regardless of its internal reality, while one that attracted suspicion or gossip could face challenges even if it was genuinely strong. This emphasis on outward appearance reinforced a culture in which maintaining a certain image was crucial, and where private truth often took a backseat to public perception. Another strange dimension was the way in which time influenced marriage, not just in terms of duration, but in how past, present, and future were interconnected within the institution. Decisions made years earlier could resurface unexpectedly, shaping current circumstances, while present actions were often evaluated based on their potential future impact. This layered sense of time made marriage feel like an ongoing story rather than a single event, with each chapter influenced by those that came before and those that were yet to come. In some cases, the absurdity became most visible in moments of conflict, where the system's complexity could either help resolve issues or make them more difficult to untangle. Disputes were rarely simple, as they often involved multiple layers of expectation and interpretation, and resolving them required navigating not just the immediate problem, but the broader framework in which it existed. This could lead to outcomes that seemed inconsistent or even contradictory, as different aspects of the system were prioritized in different situations. There were also unusual expectations about continuity of effort, where maintaining a marriage was seen as an ongoing responsibility that required constant attention and adjustment. This idea reinforced the notion that marriage was not something that simply existed, but something that had to be actively sustained, often through adherence to norms that were not always clearly defined. The effort involved in maintaining this balance could be significant, especially in a system where the rules themselves were complex and sometimes conflicting. Even more fascinating is how individuals develop strategies to navigate this complexity. Learning how to interpret rules, manage expectations, and adapt to changing circumstances in ways that allowed them to maintain stability within their relationships. This adaptability highlights the human capacity to function within even the most intricate systems, finding ways to create meaning and connection despite the challenges. Ultimately, what makes medieval marriage so remarkable is not just the strangeness of its rules, but the way those rules interacted to create a system that was both structured and fluid, predictable and uncertain. It was an institution that sought to impose order on something deeply human and variable, and in doing so, it revealed both the strengths and limitations of that approach. And within this elaborate and sometimes bewildering framework, people continue to live, connect, and build their lives, demonstrating that even in the face of complexity, the fundamental desire for companionship and belonging remains constant. And even after all of this, the most astonishing part of medieval marriage is how it continued to expand into a system where meaning itself could shift depending on interpretation, making the institution feel almost like a puzzle that people were constantly trying to solve, rather than a stable foundation they could rely on. In many cases, marriage existed in a space between certainty and ambiguity, where its definition depended not only on rules, but on how those rules were understood at any given moment. This meant that two people could experience their relationship as secure and settled, yet still face challenges if someone else interpreted their situation differently, turning marriage into something that could be questioned, even when it seemed firmly established. There were also peculiar expectations about consistency in narrative, where couples were expected to present a coherent story about their relationship that aligned with social norms, and any inconsistencies in that story could lead to doubt or suspicion. This made storytelling an essential part of marriage, as individuals had to ensure that their account of how the relationship began and developed matched what others considered acceptable. If the narrative did not fit expectations, it could be reinterpreted or challenged, sometimes leading to disputes that had little to do with the actual relationship and more to do with how it was perceived. Another strange dimension was the way in which authority could shift depending on context, with different figures, family members, community leaders, or religious authorities holding influence at different times. This created a dynamic system where power was not centralized but distributed, and navigating it required an understanding of when and how each authority might assert itself. A decision that seemed final in one context could be reopened in another, adding to the sense that marriage was not a single agreement, but an ongoing negotiation. In some instances, the absurdity became most apparent in how small details could carry disproportionate weight, as minor deviations from expected behavior could be interpreted as signs of larger issues. This tendency to read deeply into small actions meant that couples were often judged not just on significant events, but on everyday interactions, creating a level of scrutiny that could feel overwhelming. At the same time, larger issues could sometimes be overlooked if the outward appearance of the marriage remained intact, highlighting a disconnect between perception and reality. There were also unusual ideas about alignment, where marriages were expected to fit within a broader pattern of social harmony, and any deviation from that pattern could be seen as disruptive. This expectation extended beyond the couple themselves, influencing how their relationship interacted with the wider community, and reinforcing the idea that marriage was not just a private bond, but a component of a larger system. Maintaining this alignment required careful attention to both personal and social dynamics, adding another layer of complexity to an already intricate institution. Even more fascinating is how individuals learn to navigate these expectations over time, developing a kind of intuitive understanding of how the system worked and how to operate within it. This knowledge was often passed down informally through observation and experience, rather than through explicit instruction, making it both deeply ingrained and difficult to articulate. It highlights how much of medieval marriage relied on shared cultural understanding, rather than clearly defined rules. Ultimately, the deeper you go, the more medieval marriage begins to look like a system built on layers of interpretation, where meaning was never entirely fixed and where individuals had to constantly engage with the rules in order to make sense of their own relationships. The absurdity lies in how something so fundamental could become so complex, shaped by a combination of law, belief, and social expectation that turned marriage into both a structure and a process at the same time. And yet, within this shifting and sometimes bewildering framework, people continued to find ways to connect, adapt, and create lives together, proving that even the most complicated systems cannot fully contain the depth and variability of human relationships. And even after unfolding all of these layers, medieval marriage still stretches into an even deeper level of complexity, where the very idea of certainty begins to dissolve, leaving behind a system that functioned almost like a living organism, constantly adjusting, reacting, and reshaping itself through human behavior. In this world, marriage was not just something people entered into, it was something they continuously participated in, almost as if it required ongoing validation through daily life. A couple did not simply become married and remain so without question. They had to live in ways that reaffirmed that status, aligning their actions with expectations that were often unspoken yet deeply enforced by those around them. There were also peculiar expectations about coherence, where every part of a person's life was expected to align with their marital role, creating a kind of pressure to ensure that no aspect of behavior contradicted the identity of being married. If inconsistencies appeared, whether in actions, decisions, or even attitudes, they could be interpreted as signs that something within the marriage was not functioning properly. This created a situation where individuals were not only managing their relationship, but also constantly monitoring how well it fit into a broader pattern of social logic. Another strange dimension was the way in which interpretation could shift over time, meaning that the same marriage could be viewed differently at different stages of life or under different circumstances. What was once considered acceptable or even ideal could later be questioned, not because the relationship had changed, but because the context around it had. This fluidity made marriage feel less like a fixed point and more like a moving target, where understanding and acceptance were always subject to revision. In some cases, the absurdity became most evident in how silence and assumption played a role in maintaining the system. Many expectations were never formally stated, yet they were widely understood, creating a shared framework that people followed without necessarily being able to explain it. This reliance on implicit knowledge made the system both efficient and fragile, as it depended on everyone having a similar understanding of what was expected. When that understanding broke down, confusion and conflict could quickly arise. There were also unusual ideas about continuity that extended beyond the individuals involved, as marriage was often seen as part of a larger narrative that included family history, social standing, and future aspirations. This meant that each marriage was not just about the present moment, but about how it fit into a broader story, adding a sense of weight and significance that went beyond the immediate relationship. Decisions were often made with this larger narrative in mind, sometimes prioritizing long-term considerations over present desires. Even more fascinating is how individuals developed a kind of adaptability that allowed them to function within this complex system, learning how to interpret expectations, manage perceptions, and adjust their behavior in ways that maintained balance. This adaptability was not always conscious. It often emerged through experience, as people observed others and gradually internalized the patterns that governed social life. It highlights the human ability to navigate even the most intricate structures, finding ways to operate within them while still maintaining a sense of personal identity. The contradictions within the system also became more apparent at this level, as rules that were meant to create order could sometimes produce confusion, and expectations that were intended to provide clarity could instead introduce ambiguity. Yet these contradictions did not necessarily undermine the system. In many ways, they were part of what allowed it to function, providing multiple pathways through which situations could be interpreted and resolved. Ultimately, the deeper you explore medieval marriage, the more it reveals itself as a system built not just on rules, but on interpretation, perception, and adaptation, where the absurdity lies in how something so central to human life became so layered and complex. And still, within all of this, people continued to form bonds, navigate challenges, and build their lives, demonstrating that even in the most elaborate and sometimes bewildering systems, the fundamental human drive for connection remains resilient and enduring. And even beyond all of this, medieval marriage reveals an even deeper level of strangeness. When you begin to see it not as a fixed institution, but as something that existed in a constant state of negotiation between expectation and reality, where nothing was ever entirely settled, and everything could, in some way, be revisited or reinterpreted. In such a system, marriage was less like a destination and more like an ongoing process, one that required continuous alignment between personal behavior and social perception, as if the relationship itself needed to be repeatedly proven through everyday actions. This created a subtle but persistent pressure, where individuals were not only living their lives, but also performing them in a way that maintained the appearance of order and legitimacy. There were also peculiar expectations about alignment across different areas of life, where marriage was expected to fit with everything else: family structure, social status, economic role, and even personality.